Hi everyone, I'm Hisnara, the editor of cheekylittlecareers.com, and I'm delighted to say that I've been joined by Chris Williams, who is a partner at Clyde Co, and three aspiring lawyers, Charlotte, Anton, and Reyniers. We're going to be talking to Chris about his work as an IP specialist and also life as a partner at Clyde's. Before I sort of ask Chris to introduce themselves, why don't I firstly get the students to say hello? So Charlotte, why don't you briefly introduce yourself first?
Hello, my name's Charlotte and I've just graduated with an English degree from the University of York, and in October I will be starting the MA Law conversion with ULaw, just to kickstart my career in law. I'm very excited for it.
Thank you, Charlotte. Anton, how about you? You're in Singapore at the moment, aren't you?
I am, yeah. So I was at university many years ago. I started as a creative strategist within ad agencies, left London and moved to Singapore in 2011 with ad agencies, and I then moved into Netflix. I was there for a bit and then moved to Google last year.
And you are also, I'm assuming, aspiring to be a lawyer, otherwise you need
I am
to
indeed.
leave this call now.
Yes, I am. So yeah, I'm signed up to start the GDL online part-time this September.
Fantastic. And Reyniers, last but by no means least, what about you? You're a science grad, aren't you?
Yeah, so I'll be graduating at the end of this year in a master's in biomedical engineering, and I'm looking to convert to move into the intellectual property world.
So this could not be a better opportunity for you to have a bona fide IP partner sat right in front of you. Fantastic. So Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and also a little bit about Clyde's?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello. Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me. As you say, I'm Chris. I'm a partner in Clyde Co's IP disputes practice. I've been with the firm for just over a year, so reasonably new. So joined during the lockdown period, which was quite an adventure. I started off qualifying into the commercial disputes practice at Evershed quite a number of years ago. Spent my formative years dealing with a mix of general commercial disputes and IP, and as time's gone on, that increasingly led to predominant now IP practice. In terms of the firm, quite new to the firm. And what has really struck me, I think, in joining during the lockdown is how welcoming everybody has been. So it was quite an unusual and unprecedented time to start, where nobody's in the office. First days spent at home, as indeed were the first number of months, and arguably we're still working from home most of the time. So I was very grateful actually for the firm being so welcoming, and people from different offices around the world emailing me and arranging conversations, etc.
And how did you end up going from sort of commercial disputes to IP?
Well, I think like most of these sort of issues that arise, it's down to client needs. Most of the work I was doing at those early days, you tend to build relationships with certain clients, and as a result of that, you tend to do more work with that particular client. And that led me quite early on, certainly within my first year of qualification, into doing probably more than half of a workload being IP, and that's increased since. And it's something I've just really enjoyed. You get to meet a really interesting, diverse range of people through different sectors. I think the phrase I've heard quite recently is IP is quite sectorally agnostic, so you're not tied to one particular specialism, but IP cuts through all of them. And I think that mix and that general variety is something that's continued to keep me very much engaged.
Reyniers, you had a question, didn't you, about Chris and his move? He's talked about it a bit more, but what do you want to ask him?
So you've previously worked at a couple of other laws. We just wanted to know what motivates you to join Clyde, and how would you differentiate it?
Great question there. So there are actually a number of factors for joining. I think one of the main factors is I needed a global platform for my client base, and that's something that Clyde Co is incredibly well equipped to deal with. I like the fact there is an existing IP practice in several jurisdictions that works together quite closely. So that gives a nice, smooth process for clients that have issues around the world. I was also attracted by Clyde & Co's very substantial arbitration practice. IP arbitrations are becoming much more frequent. In fact, I've got two on at the moment. So I think having that heavyweight litigation practice as part of the firm was a big draw. But also a real big motivation is in perhaps the year or so before joining, I got to meet a number of Clyde & Co people, and we sort of met and discussed how things could work. And there was just a real synergy of outlook between us. I mean, Clyde is very ambitious. As you say, I've only been here a year, but in that time, we've opened numerous offices around the world, in the US and elsewhere. So this idea of growing and ambition and working in a collaborative way, both within our domestic offices and more globally, was really appealing. So I think the basic answer was it sounded like a really fun adventure. And certainly over the last year, it's been that in buckets.
Thank you, Chris. And then Charlotte, you had a question about application forms and something that we all dread, which is those emails saying, sorry, you've not been successful.
Yes, hi Chris. So you once mentioned in a LinkedIn post that we saw that as a student, Clyde actually rejected your application for a vacation scheme. And we just wanted to know, like, what helped you bounce back and what kind of advice would you give to students that are going through the same thing?
Yeah, very, very strong research there, Charlotte. No, well done. And yes, that is absolutely true. So I had done a history degree at Exeter, and I applied for a vacation scheme. I would assume probably perhaps after graduation, but perhaps more likely it would have been during my final year. And I was completely clueless about how to go about filling in that sort of application form. I didn't have any contacts in law. My previous work experience had been in a supermarket. And in those days, we're going back just over 20 years, there wasn't really a great deal by way of resource, certainly nothing like this that I could tap into. So I would apply to, well, I did apply to Clyde & Co and was rejected. I'm sure, despite strong academics, I'm sure it was largely due to sort of a misalignment between what I would actually put on my form, what they were actually looking for. So you mentioned, I think, this sort of horrible feeling that people get when they get rejections. And even though this was more than 20 years ago, I can very much remember, because it wasn't just the Clyde & Co application I made and rejected. I was sort of had numerous rejections, but I can still very much feel the sort of raw, horrible feeling that it does give to you. And what I'd actually intended to do was I suppose I'd have finished my exams probably around the June or July. I was going to work in a credit insurance company in Cardiff, which is now called Atradius, over those few summer months, then start the GDL in the September. But having received these rejections, and also I think, to be fair, having gained an understanding that I was really enjoying the work that I was doing, I took the decision to postpone starting the GDL from that September to the following September. And looking back, I have to say that is probably the single best career move that I ever made, was not starting that GDL, but actually putting it forward a month, because that gave me a 15-month window of working in Atradius. And I was very lucky. I worked under people, Steve Jones, Chris Winwell and others, and they just invested very heavily in me. I just finished my degree. As I said, I had no sort of even office experience. I was, in terms of commercial awareness, absolutely clueless. And they, over that period, really did help me. And as well as learning about global trade and how just office life worked, I saw how they interacted on a professional level and how they coached juniors. And as I say, we're going back around 20 years now, but I think during that period, for me, they sort of wrote the book on best practice for how to act, how to coach juniors, and how you interact with other people. So absolutely invaluable. And what I then did is, in the next application round, I sort of wrapped up everything I'd learned, and I probably had huge input from Sue and Chris and others. So I made another much better informed set of applications, and then had several offers, and started the GDL as scheduled the year later. And thinking back now, I think even if I hadn't have had that period, and even if I had then in the next round finessed the applications and started the training contract, I really wouldn't have been able to have made the most of it in the way that I did, having had that 15 months experience. And you mentioned there how others can potentially sort of benefit from the experience I had. And one of the things I would certainly say is, if something isn't working, so you're making applications, perhaps you're being rejected at the paper phase or the interview stage, I think firms are much better now at giving feedback than they would have been then. So really, I think, get as much feedback as you can possibly get, and really listen to that feedback. And if you can see that clearly there's a mismatch between, as you say, your experience, what you're offering to a firm, and what other people are offering, which is why they are being accepted, not you, what can you actually do about it? So in my case, it was quite simple. It was to get some relevant experience that I could apply to answer the questions in a much better way, so they no longer started, when I was at school or when I was at university, but I could apply it much more into a workplace setting. I think that was hugely helpful, and I think involving others. I mean, I mentioned a couple of people that are at the front of my mind who I worked with 20 years ago. So, if you can involve other people, and people really, this is the thing you'll find, I think, and I wouldn't have known this then, people actually do want to help other people, because lots of people wouldn't have had this smooth journey in. And I think those that haven't and have to do other sort of things are really keen to sort of share their experience with others. So do you really get as much support and advice as you can get, and I think that will really help you. So as I say, and be not sort of too self-critical, but think, if it isn't working, am I just going to send the same applications a year later, just with a different date, or is there something I can do to make those applications more attractive to the person reading them?
And Anton, as a career changer, what did you want to ask Chris?
Well, yeah, I was going to ask, because I'm coming to law somewhat later in life, and I was going to pretty much ask off the back of that, what advice would you give to a more mature kind of entrant who has had quite a disparate, I suppose, experience, given it's been marketing and advertising? What kind of, I suppose, advice you could provide in terms of someone kind of approaching law now? Somebody
who's had a career elsewhere and develop skills would be incredibly attractive to a law firm. There's a number of reasons for that. One is, when you're discussing things within a team, people talk about cognitive diversity, this idea of different experiences having a huge role to play in making decisions. I'm sort of just picturing, going through various scenarios with other team members, having somebody like you who have done other things, you will have experienced certain challenges that I'm sure in a team working through to gain a particular solution, or get to a particular solution, would be able to benefit from greatly. I'm sure that when you deal with clients, and a large part, as you know, going through isn't just the legal work as such, it's developing these relationships and being able to draw upon that experience that you've got. What I would be inclined to do is to list things out and then have a chat with a good number of people and say, look, this is the experience, this is why I think these things are helpful, and have people help you finesse that to get to the stage where, as I say, you're going to be as marketable as possible.
What do IP lawyers do, especially for students who perhaps aren't familiar with IP and what that includes, and how does that reflect your day-to-day responsibilities?
Yeah, so it might be, as you say, for those who are a little bit unfamiliar with how things work, it might be quite useful if I briefly introduce perhaps the IP life cycle. We can work from there, because as an IP lawyer, you can be involved from the outset in initial brand strategy, from when perhaps a start comes to you in the first place, general advice. You can then develop from there any appropriate registrations that need to be made, whether they're trademarks, patents, or other form of registerable rights. Then you've got commercialization. Often IP can be the dominant asset of a company, so how they commercialize and how they monetize that. And the things you can do to help them there, right the way through to enforcement. So as I say, I'm in the disputes team. So as a litigator, I'm dealing more with the stuff at the end of that, whereas my colleagues in transactional departments will be dealing with licensing and other forms of communication, commercialization. So you've got the range. You've also got the split between what's generally called the soft IP and the hard IP being patents, soft IP, trademarks, copyright, and the others. In terms of how that works together in terms of groupings, you've got, as I say, advising on brand strategy. You can be giving clearance advice to clients who want to use a particular name, whether it's for their company or for a sub-brand. If they're entering a new market, they don't want to be treading on anybody's toes, or if they do want to tread on somebody's toes, then they want to do so knowingly. Identifying and registering the IP rights and the ways of doing that. The commercialization, whether there's some form of licensing agreements, drafting those, negotiating them. And as I say, the things which I would do more, which is the enforcement and dealing with whether you're bringing an enforcement action for infringement or defending an enforcement action. You've also got other sorts of matters which are before the, for example, the Intellectual Property Office, where there's arguments over whether a trademark should in fact be registered, whether an existing trademark should be cancelled. So you've got all these different sort of strands, which in IP perhaps less so than in some sectors, there's sometimes a blurring between the truly contentious and the transactional, and there's a bit more sort of grey in between. I've always, I have to say, been right on the contentious side, whereas some of my colleagues do span that divide a little bit more.
Charlotte, you had a question, didn't you, about a case that was in the news recently?
Yes, I did. I'm sure we'll all have heard about it. It was quite prevalent on social media. I'd be wondering, sort of, can you give us your take on M&S suing Aldi for their infringement of its Colin the Caterpillar trademark? And sort of what kind of work would you do or other lawyers do on these kinds of cases, really?
So Colin is the protagonist in a dispute between, as you say, Marks and Spencer's and Aldi. A number of years ago, and I don't know how many, but possibly back as far as the 1990s, Marks and Spencer's introduced a cake, which it called Colin, and marketed quite heavily, and it's been very, very successful. Aldi came along at some point later and introduced a cake, a caterpillar cake, which it called Cuthbert. And Marks Spencer, putting it simply, said, "Hang on, this isn't really fair." Marks Spencer's will have said, "Well, we've got trademarks in Colin the Caterpillar." I think they possibly even protected the design of the box and possibly even the general shape of the cake. They said, "Hang on, we've got sort of another company that's coming along with Cuthbert. People are going to be confused. People are going to look at this product and think it's associated to Marks and Spencer's or Colin, and take advantage of this goodwill it's built up over the period." And I think there have been other sort of spats between Marks and Spencer's and Aldi, and this was probably the final straw. Marks and Spencer said, "Right, we're going to take action against you for breaching the trademarks and taking advantage of the goodwill passing off element." So they issued proceedings, and the actual legal stuff is much less interesting than the point you mentioned, because you didn't say, "Oh, there were some quite interesting nuances in the trademark." You said social media, and I think that's where the interest of this case actually is. So the case went to court, and Aldi then launched a series of Twitter campaigns based on, I think, free Cuthbert. And I remember seeing these images of this sort of cake behind bars. And it was actually it was well done. And I think a lot of people were very receptive to it. And I think that irrespective of the legal arguments, arguably, Aldi will have got the better of the PR war. And I think that's important. And in terms of what the lawyers would do, is I'd imagine, as well as preparing the legal positions, I would imagine that the lawyers, particularly on Aldi's side, would have worked very closely with Aldi's social media team to ensure that what they were putting out, okay, it actually resonated with the public, which is the important bit, but also didn't overstep the mark. It wouldn't have given Marks and Spencer's an advantage in the litigation, or perhaps even if they went too far in criticising M&S, give them an additional cause of action. A brand owner needs to think very carefully, because you've got the court and the strict legal arguments, but you've also got this court public opinion, and it's the people who buy, that's where the money comes from to make these companies successes or failures. And if you get it wrong, and perhaps you bring proceedings or you defend them, and it just doesn't chime well with the public, then you could damage or completely destroy a brand.
Thank you, Chris. I'm afraid we've completely overrun, and only because you had such interesting answers. And I hope you've said something helpful for everyone watching, but also the student interviewers that I've got sat here with me. There was so much to take away. I don't know where to start in terms of summing up. But why don't we all say thank you to Chris for his contribution to this interview. I think it's been fascinating. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah,
It's been
thank
a
you
real
very much.
pleasure. No, thank you. Thank you again for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to speak to all of you.